The 545th edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
And that could make a difference. Lawson at the buzzer. Got it! Maybe not. Ty Lawson wins it at the buzzer.
Deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a coach.
Gets the roll. Here we go. Page has it. Carolina down one. 84-83. Page into the front court with 4 seconds. Page to the rim. Got it! Got it! 9/10 of a second to go. Inbounds. Washington gets it to Warren. His full court shot. No good. Marcus Page baby. Does it for the Tar Heels. Carolina wins it.
Don't force it if you're Goss. Comes in. Blocked by Meeks. Buried up ahead to Jackson. And he tucks it down for the 5-point lead. Matthews off the mark. And this year the confetti is going to fall for North Carolina. They're not going to be denied this time. Inside 30 overall. Love, top of the key. Oh! Big time delivery.
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome into another live edition of the Four Corners podcast. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. Josh and Anthony here with you guys once again on a Monday night. It's our second show of the day, but we got news after we recorded this morning. News that we talked about we needed to get made official sometime this week, and unfortunately for Carolina, or maybe fortunately for Carolina, they got some of that news that we were talking about. If you don't know by now, Ian Jackson entered the transfer portal earlier today after just one season with the Carolina basketball program. We're here to talk about that because I think there's a conversation to be had around Carolina not being able to really get the most out of these five-star prospects in recent years. So we'll take a look at that. We'll take a look at what this means for what Carolina can now do in the portal, and maybe a prediction or two for where we think Ian Jackson goes next in his basketball journey. Before we get to that, though, we start every edition of the show with the pod thought of the day. We go to Dean Smith for today's pod thought. We'll take what's right off the website where I get these from. That thought is, quote, people who have inner strength, inner affirmation, don't need the external affirmation associated with the winning team. Those who don't have that inner feeling depend on sports to give it to them. That, I think, is the wrong use of sports, end quote. Don't know if we've ever used that quote or not. There's a lot to analyze from that quote there from Coach Smith, but we'll just go ahead and get right into what we're here to do, which is talk about Ian Jackson entering the portal. We're less than an hour away from the tip-off from the 2025 National Championship game between Florida and Houston, so we don't want to keep you waiting too long into the night. But, we talked this morning about Carolina needing to get answers on Ian Jackson, Drake Powell, and Kay Tyson and their respective futures in Chapel Hill. And about, 3:30, 3:45, 4 o'clock, Ian Jackson made it known that he was transferring out of the program, joining Elliot Cadeau and Jalen Washington as now the three Tar Heels to leave the program this offseason. Of course, a former five-star recruit, McDonald's All-America. He averaged 11.9 points per game, 2.7 rebounds, 0.7 assists during his time in Chapel Hill. Played in 36 games, averaged about 24 minutes per contest. Started a handful of games there in the early part of the ACC season, but this became a possibility because when Carolina was surging to make the tournament, his role was diminishing and was becoming less and less to the point where he played, I think, just 10 minutes in the season-ending loss to Ole Miss in the NCAA tournament. And when the season came to an end and after those initial end-of-season meetings took place, we were led to believe that this was going to be the case, that Ian Jackson was going to exit the program, either going through the draft or entering the transfer portal. Now that the news is made official, how do you process seeing another 5-star prospect leave the program? And it's not because he's turning pro, it's because he's seeking a transfer to go somewhere else and play his college basketball.
Yeah, I mean, it's not ideal, but it's what we expected. I know that there were a lot of people that were caught off guard by this, that basically said this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. We thought he was either just going to the NBA or he was going to be coming back. That was never the case. I think we knew that from the word go, and everything that I've heard from people that are on the Inside Carolina message boards said that that was what was being said on there the whole time too. Guys, he was never coming back. The way that he lost his job at the end of the season and he lost his playing time, that was not going to be well received by him. I think we all knew that. And this just shows you that that's exactly what ended up happening, unfortunately. So, it sucks. It's definitely concerning that it is another 5-star, because it shows you that these guys are being brought into the program and they're not being turned into anything, especially not here. They are transferring to other schools. For a guy like Caleb Love, he may have helped himself enough, especially with the way that he performed down the stretch of the season and then into the NCAA tournament, might have helped himself enough where he could get a shot in the NBA as maybe a second rounder. But everybody else, I mean, it's since, what is it? I think it's since 2019 or 2020. It's one of the two. Carolina has had 6 guys that are 5-star prospects, and only one of them has made it to the NBA. And that one guy that has made it to the NBA is Day'Ron Sharpe. That's it. So something has to be done, because they're not developing these guys the way that they should be getting developed. Now, I don't know if, you look at that and, that was towards the end of the Roy Williams era. So you could say that it's not all on Hubert, but it certainly is a big Hubert problem as well, that these guys are just not getting developed the way that they need to. I think this speaks to the fact that the staff needs to be overhauled. I think that Hubert Davis is the guy that's in place. I still believe he's the right guy as the head coach of this team, but I think it shows you that the rest of the coaches, there need to be some hard conversations about these guys. And with where we're at in the offseason and how long we've already been in the offseason, I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen, which is a problem. So we'll have to see what they do. But yeah, it is pretty damning that another 5-star comes into the program, doesn't have the type of success that you would expect that player to have, and now is exiting for another destination, which at this point, I mean, to me, seems pretty obvious where he's headed, but we'll have to just wait and see.
I think when you look at Ian Jackson and the conversation around him, I think it's more complicated than others, because when he emerged at the end of December, early January, we were not questioning if this staff could develop or could develop him, if he was getting, if he was trending in the right direction to being a one and done prospect. You go back to our podcast in early January, we were talking about him becoming this team's number 1 option over RJ Davis, because he was the more explosive scorer, which is what he is. That's what he does. The reality is that that's all he does. And I think the disconnect with Hubert and the staff was they could never really get him to buy in to just try to play defense and at least look and give some sort of effort. You're talking about a guy that averaged less than 3 rebounds per game. And this was when, this is on a team that struggled to rebound the ball. And there was always that reinforced message from Hubert Davis that we all got to get to the backboard. This was not a guy that wanted to be a part of that. And you look at his assist numbers, averaging less than 1 assist per game. It's not that he lacked the ability to pass the basketball. It was just the simple fact that usually once the ball got in Ian Jackson's hands, the ball stopped there. And there were some times that was great. And Carolina had a lot of success with that. when he scored 20 points in 5 of 6 games or whatever the number was. But I think this is a guy that, yes, you can sit here and complain about the staff, and I'm not trying to protect the staff. The player deserves a lot of criticism as well, because I mentioned it and I referenced it. He mentally checked out, I thought, in Carolina's blowout loss at Clemson, where that was when Hubert Davis went to the first initial big lineup. Remember, it'd be the next game where he'd put Drake Powell into the starting lineup, and he moved Ian Jackson, to the bench. And there were games where Ian Jackson was a productive scorer and gave Carolina what Carolina needed off the bench. But there were a lot of games, man, where he was just nowhere to be found, and he was MIA. And to me, I felt like he just checked out on the team, the program, the coaching staff, because he was no longer playing starting like minutes. And that's just my opinion. I could be 100% wrong about that. But that's just the way that, from a body language perspective, that's what I looked at, and that's what I saw when I saw Ian Jackson play, which I think really makes this all the more complicated, because there's no doubt that Carolina they're in need of his abilities, like his talent. Like, now there is a massive hole on this roster, and there is an exceeding level of pressure on Hubert Davis, his staff, and Jim Tanner to put at least one, if not two, guys on this roster out of the portal that can do what he can do, which is score the ball in the explosive manner that he was able to do so. But I don't think that he's free of blame here. Like, there's a conversation about this staff, and yes, they have not developed talent the way that you expect the staff at UNC to develop talent. But I think as much as any individual player and the guys that you mentioned that have left the program seeking a transfer, he's as much to blame as to why it went wrong as any of those other former 5-star prospects.
Yeah, I mean, you look at down the stretch of the season, the final 5 games of the year, he played an average of 14.2 minutes per game, and that was in large part because he shot just 21% from the field, 26% from 3, and averaged 3.4 points per game. That was it. And so you look at, the game, you go back, even if you go final 6 games of the year, I mean, that game against Duke at home, he was a big part of why Carolina wasn't able to come away with the victory. He's a big part of the reason why the offense slowed down the way that it did in the second half, was because he got some possessions. And we talked about it back during that game, how he got some possessions and didn't move the basketball. And all of a sudden that really set Carolina's offense to be stagnant for the rest of the night. So I do think that's something that he's going to have to work on as a player, is finding ways to be a little bit more selfless with the basketball, because it's what your team is going to need in order for you to be successful. But yeah, I mean, you then talk about the effort issues. And I think once he started to lose his role on the team as a full-time, starter, or a guy that played starter-like minutes, I think that was really where you started to see the issues defensively. And, we got to the point where late in the year, we were asking ourselves, hey, if he's not scoring the ball, then what is he actually out there for? I mean, you're talking about in the conference tournament game against the Duke Blue Devils, I mean, where Carolina had a chance to advance on in the conference semifinals and really had a shot to lock themselves into the NCAA tournament. He goes 0 for 4 in that game, doesn't score a point. In Carolina's loss to Ole Miss in the NCAA tournament, round of 64, he scores 1 point in the game, doesn't make a field goal. Those are areas where you needed him to step up. They didn't happen. And then you got to the point where you were saying, well, what is he really bringing to this team? Because he's not a great defender. The effort really isn't there. He's not a great rebounder, and he doesn't share the basketball all that well. So what is he really bringing to the table for us? And so, I think it sucks that it didn't work out here. And yes, there is a deeper conversation that's there. But I do think you're right that this is a guy who has to share in some of the blame for why things went the way that they went here at Carolina, and why things got as bad as they did towards the end of his 1 year in Chapel Hill? Those are the questions that I think we're going to be asking ourselves for a while, because you go back and you look at how effective he was during that stretch to start conference play. And you thought you were legitimately looking at the next great guard for Carolina. You were looking at a guy that when he got cooking, he was as hard as anybody in the country to slow down. But you saw he struggled in the middle portion of the season. He kind of got it back a little bit during that stretch where Carolina started putting it together at the end of the regular season against, really started with that game against Syracuse. And he had a, really successful stretch until that second Duke game. But after that, he got thrown off once again, and that was really where we saw that effort level diminish. So, I think it's a head-scratching one for sure, but that's why we are where we're at today, where Carolina is now in the position where not only do they have to look for one scoring guard, they now have to look for a second scoring guard in the portal if they are going to be as competitive as we hope they're going to be next year.
Yep, and I think, This is not this. It's important to remember, and you just saw this on Saturday night, that culture still matters and culture still wins out over talent. You look at Houston's culture and how they were able to beat Duke. Like, their culture won out over Duke's talent, over Duke's ability, and so I think what Carolina fans have to juggle with is, was he a great talent? Absolutely. Was he a great culture guy? Was he what Hubert Davis wants, or is he what Hubert Davis is looking for? I think that answer is no. Just simply because he was a individual player that really thrived as long as he was being featured, as long as the ball was in his hands and he could do the things he wanted to do, then he was willing to maybe run back and play defense, or maybe crash the glass and get a rebound or two. When those things weren't happening, his effort in the other areas really lacked, and that was a big issue for this team, a year ago. Now, granted, now you got to replace the talent. You got to bring in a guy or two that could do what he was able to do. But if you can bring in guys that can do that, but also give you much more consistent effort defensively, aren't the ball stoppers on offense that he was, then Carolina could greatly benefit from that. Let's just get to what the big talking point is around his portal decision, and it's the track record of 5-star prospects the last decade or so, and this is what's happened with him. Ian Jackson has entered the transfer portal. He's the most recent. Drake Powell, could either be a one and done, which would be, I guess, a good thing for Carolina, because at least you're putting a guy in the NBA, or he could be back with the program. Elliot Cadeau, transfer. Caleb Love, transfer. Day'Ron Sharpe, NBA. Walker Kessler, of course, he transferred after the retirement of Roy Williams. Carolina's got a 5-star prospect coming in this upcoming recruiting class with Caleb Wilson. He just competed last week in the McDonald's All-American game. Is this a concern, though, for Carolina on the recruiting trail when they're recruiting these high school prospects? Because Hubert Davis has not shied away from trying to recruit the best talent in high school, and really get a nice blend of youthful talent from the high school level and surrounding that with veteran experience out of the transfer portal. But there is this concerning trend that, the Carolina, since the NCAA has gotten off campus, they've been able to get more 5-stars, to Chapel Hill than they were there in the mid-2010s. But these guys aren't staying here. And it's not because they're staying because they're going pro. They're staying, or they're leaving and going to play somewhere else at the collegiate level. So how much of a concern should this be for Hubert Davis and their staff moving forward as they try to navigate high school recruiting, which, a lot of coaches feel very different about it. I still think at a school like Carolina, you really want to use high school to maybe set the talent level for what your team can bringing in guys straight out of high school.
Yeah, I mean, you should be pretty concerned about it. In terms of how it's affecting high school recruiting, it's really not. I mean, you found a way to bring a lot of these guys in, but at some point, it's got to start becoming a little bit of a concern that basically the route that most of these guys are going is they're entering the transfer portal. It's not even that they're going to the NBA after 1 year. And that's ultimately the goal that you should have when you're bringing in these 5-star prospects, is to try to get them to the NBA as quickly as possible. Not every guy is going to make it to the NBA. But the thing that's amazing is that not a single guy on that list has even come close to making it to the NBA in their first year, except for maybe Drake Powell. That's the one that we got to see. And even if that ends up happening, a lot of that is due to upside. It's not even really what he showed at Carolina this year, because he still has areas that he has to improve in as an offensive player. That's what's crazy. And that's what I think is really disheartening, is that Carolina used to be an NBA factory. And part of it is that things are different now. I mean, guys, that went to the NBA, like a guy like Tyler Hansbrough, never getting drafted again that high in the NBA draft. Everything has changed. The way that they look at these prospects, it's all based on what you could be, not what you are in that moment. So very rare that you're going to see guys like that get drafted. But at the same time, Carolina should have been adjusting along the way to being able to develop these 5-stars. They're landing these guys. I mean, you're just coming off a recruiting cycle where you landed 2 5-star prospects in Ian Jackson and Drake Powell. But there's a chance that neither one of them go to the NBA. You know that one of them is more than likely not going to be with you. I mean, I'd be stunned, but, I can't completely rule it out because I just don't know. I haven't gotten anything that's told me that it's impossible that Ian Jackson comes back. He could pull a Seth Trimble from last year, although I think it's highly unlikely. But there's a good chance that he will not be on your roster. So this is something that is definitely has to be a concern. But you mentioned with Day'Ron Sharpe, with Walker Kessler, this isn't just a thing that extends back that extends through the tenure of Hubert Davis. It goes back to the end of the Roy Williams era as well. So Carolina, they've got to get that part figured out, because the more and more this keeps happening, the easier it is to see that eventually high school recruiting would go down. You would start to understand if it did, because to this point, I mean, to a certain extent, it's almost amazing, and it's almost a credit to Hubert Davis and his staff how it hasn't gotten to that point here with what we've seen the last few years. With what we've seen in terms of the guys entering the transfer portal, but not making it to the NBA. So, I mean, yeah, it's something they have to get figured out as soon as possible if they want to be able to continue to land these 5-star prospects.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I think you look back at some of these situations and why they haven't panned out. I think makes sense. And then why they haven't panned out doesn't make any sense at all. This is where the frustration for me lies with Pat Sullivan, because that was a move that when Hubert Davis shook up the staff after taking over for Roy Williams, he brought him in from the NBA level. He had spent 18 years in the NBA. And the selling point of him was, well, this would be a guy that has, the connections at that, at the next level. So he has those relationships. But also he worked in player development and was going to really be a part of getting the most out of the talent that Hubert Davis was looking to bring in. And that just has not happened. And so, when we've talked about wanting to see staff changes made, like for me, that's where it starts and it ends. Equally as much with Sean May, who's in charge of the big men, just because you haven't seen the big men, kind of grow and develop during his time on the bench. But part of that also goes back to, who's in charge of the player development program. And you would imagine that's what Pat Sullivan is doing, because that's what he was brought in to do when he left I think it was Minnesota Timberwolves to join Hubert Davis' staff. So this is something that's got to get figured out. Like, if you're going to recruit this level of talent, and it makes a lot of sense because Carolina should be recruiting the best that the high school level has to offer, you have got to maximize that talent and maximize it by developing it to make sure it's ready to produce at a high level at the college level. And then what you're doing is you're supplementing that with the experienced guys that you want to go get out of the transfer portal, because that's kind of what is winning right now. You look at the way UConn was able to build some of their championships. It was bringing in experienced guys out of the portal to supplement their young talent that was being developed, that after 1 or 2 years they were ready to go on to the NBA. So as I said, I think the conversation around Jackson is very tricky, because I think as much as the coaching staff failed him, I think there is much blame in terms of him not living up to his end of the bargain as well, which is why I don't see a scenario where he comes back. I think it's just best for both parties to go in different directions. With that being said, just kind of didn't want to speculate on ultimately where we think Ian Jackson ends up, because he's going to be highly coveted. He's going to be highly sought after now that he's officially in the portal. Our good friend, Nada Edwards, the guy that produces the Eye on College Basketball podcast, said that we better hope he does not end up going to Storrs, Connecticut, and playing for Dan Hurley. I don't know if Ian Jackson could play for a guy that has the temperament of a Dan Hurley. Where do you think would be a good landing spot for Ian Jackson? There's going to be a lot of connections with him going back up to New York, playing for Rick Pitino and playing for St. John's. There were so much, rumors when Rick Pitino got the job that Ian Jackson was going to decommit and go play there anyway. He did not do that. Simeon Wilcher ended up doing that. But if I have questions about him being able to play for Dan Hurley, I don't know if he could play for Rick Pitino. Where do you think Ian Jackson ultimately lands up when he makes his decision on his next basketball home?
Yeah, I mean, the fit might not make sense in terms of the mentality, but you wonder if it would change because I think he's going to St. John's. I'd be stunned if that's not where he ends up. That was the team that recruited him the hardest outside of Carolina. That's a team that is going to be fighting to be one of the top teams in the country again next year. They have a spot that's open with RJ Lewis having entered the transfer portal. They have not filled that spot as of yet. And so I think this is probably the perfect fit. Now, in terms of him bringing, the same mentality there, he's going to have to want to defend, because that is going to be one of the things that Rick Pitino is going to demand from his guys. If you're not scoring the ball, he expects that you are defending. That's a big part of the reason why RJ Lewis ended up coming out of the game down the stretch of the tournament game against Arkansas for St. John's. It drew, a lot of criticism from some of the St. John's fans, but that's the way that Rick Pitino is, man. If you are not busting your rear end, he will sit you on the bench. And so I think it's going to be a little bit of a strange marriage, but I do think that's ultimately where he is going to end up. If not there, then yeah, to me, it's guaranteed to be somewhere in the Big East. I could see, a school, especially, a spot like Seton Hall. I think that'd be a great spot for him as well. Shaheen Holloway is looking for something to jumpstart that program again after a down year this year. I think he'd be a really good fit there, and that's, just south of where he is in the Bronx, where he grew up in New Jersey. So I think that could be a good fit for him as well. But again, it's another guy that's going to demand a lot out of him. So we'll see. Hopefully this was a year of, him recognizing that he needs to bring it on both ends of the floor no matter what. And that, landing somewhere with one of these Big East schools, he'll be able to compete on both ends of the floor no matter what. Because if he does, then I think he has a chance to be a real successful player.
Thing about St. John's is if he goes there, he's going to be in line to get a pretty big payday. I forget which, multi-billionaire basically came out and made it known whatever St. John's wants or needs, he has the ability to fund it. We saw what that revival looked like this past year, where the Garden was rocking every time the Johnnies took the court. There's going to be a massive financial commitment to keep that program atop the Big East for the foreseeable future. And so, and I want to say this, just because if he goes there, it does not mean he's going there because of money. You would imagine that money would play a role, but from the moment Rick Pitino got hired, we were preparing for him to decommit and go play for Rick Pitino anyway. And so this just could be a situation where he's going back home. I'm with you. I think ultimately he's in the Big East, whether it's at St. John's, UConn, Seton Hall, or wherever. I do think he'll be playing somewhere up in the Northeast. next year, which is much closer to home. Now this brings us to what's next for Carolina. And we've talked about this quite a bit because Carolina, last year they were going after every big man in the transfer portal. This year it's been virtually every guard that's entered the portal. Of course, this morning we did the conversation about Hunter Huff, the transfer from Chattanooga. There have been, some other developments in the portal since we got off the microphone earlier this morning. You mentioned it about Robert Wright III, the transfer from Baylor, which now I think has gotten the eye of every single Carolina fan. We've gotten a few comments here where he is now like basically the Henry Visar of guards for Carolina. And then we got some news earlier this evening from On3 Sports where Trey Holloman, the Michigan State transfer, there's been a lot of speculation about Carolina's involvement with him and a chance for him to come to Chapel Hill. He's scheduled a ton of visits for at the end of the dead period, which comes at the end of Thursday. And I think the article listed it by conference, where it's like the ACC, I think the Big 12, and I forget the other conference. Carolina is on that list to host Trey Holloman, who was a big-time part of all the success Michigan State enjoyed this year, winning a Big Ten regular season championship and making it all the way to the Elite Eight of the NCAA tournament before getting knocked out by Auburn. So when you look at, with Carolina now having, I guess, a clearer picture of what they can, sell and offer to recruits, how much pressure is there on Hubert Davis and Jim Tanner to land a guard of consequence, like we talked about the first 3 weeks of the portal, landing a big man of consequence?
Oh, I mean, it's immense, and it's not just one, it's two. You've got to find now a off-ball scorer, and you've got to find someone that is your point guard that can score the ball as well. So now, I mean, the task just became a little more difficult. We were looking for that one scoring point guard, and we had been throwing out some names, but yeah, now you've got to look at the scoring guard spot and see if you can find someone, because, to this point, we were, wondering, okay, as of right now, it looks like, I guess, Ian Jackson is sticking around. And so we had, I think, started to come to the conclusion that he was going to end up staying because he didn't enter in that first wave. We thought he would have been someone that would have gotten his name in there as early as possible to try to make it known that he was open for business and try to get as many of these spots to go after him as possible. But now, yeah, I mean, you got to look into a guy like R.J. Lewis Jr., maybe do a swap there with St. John's. I think that's certainly a name that should be on the table. Rodney Rice, the transfer out of Maryland, is certainly someone that you could look at. There's, a guy that just entered the portal the other day, another taller guard at 6'6", 233 pounds, and LeJon Watts, who's ranked as the 18th overall prospect in the portal right now. That's a shooting guard out of Washington State. Certainly someone that Carolina should be looking at. Now you need to be looking at all of these options. And it makes a little bit more sense why Honor Huff was a guy that Carolina was potentially looking at, because he's a guy that, as I said, I feel like he plays better off the ball. But Carolina is, doing everything they can, it looks like now, to try to get Trey Holloman in for a visit. That would be a nice addition, I think, for Carolina. A very solid player. I don't think he's going to be a guy that's, a game changer by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think all of a sudden Carolina's got the best guard in the portal, but I do think that it would be a nice fit, would give them a veteran presence back there. And then from there, it's about finding that secondary scoring option, that guy off the ball. So I think that needs to be their mindset right now, is get him on campus, see what you can do there. If it's not him, then I think Xavier Lee, the transfer from Princeton, is another name that we've heard be brought up. 6'4", 180 pounds, so he has the size. Averaged, I think, a little over 17 points per game, if I'm remembering his stats correctly, just off the top of my head. That would be, a solid addition from the mid-major level. I mean, again, he's having to come up from the Ivy League level. So we've seen that before. Carolina took a chance on Paxton Wojcik. Now this one, much more production there. Certainly a guy that was a really, really good player at that level. So you wonder, if he ends up moving up, could he be, a solid enough option there for Carolina? But those are some of the names that I think Carolina's got to look at now. And it's crucial that they get at least one name, I think, in here within the next week or so. I think, again, we've talked about how Carolina's done a lot of their damage late in the transfer portal. This is one of those cycles, though, with some of the big names that are out there and with the need for star power. You need to get one of these guys, that is a big name. And I think you'll start to see some decisions coming down soon. So Carolina needs to get to work quickly.
Yeah, the good news is they've cast a wide net, and they've got, their hands are in the cookie jar with a bunch of different prospects. You've got to bring two of them home, though, and this cannot be the backcourt version of what you had happen last year in the front court, where you're there, you're having the conversations, but these guys are going to different programs and aren't coming to play for you. So, I don't like Tom Izzo. I'm not a fan of Michigan State. I think Trey Holloman would be, a great culture fit for Carolina. Just a tough, gritty player. I think you're going to see Hubert Davis and this staff really kind of go all in on him. You looked at Robert Wright III. There's just talent there that jumps off at the floor. You watch some of what he did in the tournament, where that kid can be a real big difference maker for you. RJ Lewis, if that's a guy Carolina wants to get involved with, if he ultimately doesn't go pro. I mean, you're not the Big East Player of the Year by accident. I know the Big East hasn't been the best conference the past couple of years, but it's still a conference with a lot of great talent. That was a guy that was never afraid of the moment, was a willing defender, made big shots for the Red Storm this past year. So Carolina's got their hands full, or they've got their options at their disposal. But they've got to bring a guy or two home that could be difference makers. Like, you want to bring in a Nick Dorn or a Hunter Huff, man, like that, that's fine. But I still think you need to bring in at least one or two other impactful guys in that backcourt because I don't know. This is not a slight at Seth. I don't know if Seth Trimble is ready to be your point guard, and I don't know if that's where Seth Trimble is slated to be the most productive player that you want him to be, that you need him to be for next season. And then I think, I don't want to not say I'm not a believer in the freshmen coming in and, with Dennis and Dixon, but you don't want to put too much pressure on those guys. They are 4-star prospects, but there's going to be an acclimation process for them to where you don't want to put them in a situation where they've got to not only play a lot, but produce a lot right away. You want to be able to let them kind of grow themselves into the program. So, we've talked about it, where this is the time of the year where Carolina has done the majority of their work is after that dead period. And that needs to be the case this weekend or this week. They need to continue doing what they can do in terms of these conversations. But when this dead period ends on Thursday, it needs to be, all hands on deck, full staff go, and you're bringing in guys that can really bolster your backcourt, because that right now is going to be what make or breaks the next, the 2025-2026 season. I think Hubert's done a good job solidifying the front court. You got your big man in Visar. You expect Van Allen Lubin to come back. Caleb Wilson's a nice interchangeable wing that can play the 3 or the 4. That's primed to be a difference maker. I think James Brown could be a nice solid piece as well. Now you've got to reload the backcourt. And if Carolina can do that and you get an answer on Drake Powell, then I think this roster could be in really good shape to have the type of season Hubert Davis needs to have to really ensure that he's going to be the head coach of Carolina for the foreseeable future. So we'll have to see how this ultimately all plays out. I think, the next week or so is going to be pretty important for how next season's going to glow, or next season's going to go, because with the type of guards that are still in the portal, you expect them to kind of go off the chart pretty quickly once the dead period ends or later this week. Hopefully 1, 2, at a minimum of those guys are headed to Chapel Hill. With that, guys, it is going to wrap up this edition of the show. We're closing in, on the start of the national championship game, just around 20 minutes away before we'll crown a champion in the 2025 season will officially come to an end. So we're going to go ahead and get out of here. In the meantime, we're going to encourage you to visit the website. That's HeelToughBlog.com. Coverage from today's news can be found about Ian Jackson going into the portal. We've had you covered since the offseason began about guys entering the portal, the guys that Carolina has been involved with in the transfer portal. So you want to visit our website every single day to stay up to date on that. Also, Carolina football continued to landing football commits as well. So Bill Belichick and his staff very busy as well. And, Anthony has you covered on that front as well. So it's the busiest time of the year for us, for our site, with just all the recruiting and the transfer portal news, spring practice, you name it, we've got you covered on it. So make sure you get to the website. That's HeelToughBlog.com for the latest and the best coverage of Carolina basketball and Tar Heel football. As for the podcast, you guys know where to find us. Every major podcasting platform. Simply search the Four Corners Podcast and we will pop up. There, we encourage you guys to rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any editions of the show throughout the remainder of the basketball off season. So with that, guys, it is going to wrap up this edition of the show. I do want to thank Anthony once again for hosting with me. We want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.